A few days later, I got a call, and this time it was from the coroner's office, and Chris was dead. He had taken his life. He was just 33. He'd left a handwritten note. The person from the coroner's office cautioned me against reading it, but I had to, and there were tear stains across it. Basically, Chris said he was just too tired to fight anymore. And he closed it by apologizing, by telling me how much he loved me. And he closed the note with these words: "Someday, promise me you'll write that book." So here I am, more than 30 years later, and the book is done.
Welcome to the Persistence U podcast with Lisbeth. That's you as in university, but we're really much more of a community here. Your host is Lisbeth Meredith. She's an author, speaker, and online teacher. Each week, she'll be delivering amazing stories from survivors and thrivers, all threaded together with a dose of persistence. We're so glad you're listening.
Persisters and brothers, welcome. And how are you doing this week? I am excited to bring to you author Jack Maher. If you're watching on YouTube, you see Oliver saying hello to you. But anyway, I love this time of year right where I live. It is April the 29th as I record this. Tomorrow I'll be going to Birmingham to do a book event and talk, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And of course, by the time that you hear this, it'll be much later, but I look forward to it. And often, because I am more of an introvert, even though I like people a lot, I'll get really excited about booking a speaking gig and really anxious beforehand. And I think that's fairly normal. Any kind of huge change of routine, I can lose a little sleep, but this one I'm just really looking forward to. I've not spent a lot of time, any time in Birmingham, so it's going to be pretty terrific. I also have found, I had a speed bump with a couple of things recently, and I'm picking up some contract work, but I found that if maybe you feel this way too, if I tell my close friends what I need, they show up like no other. And I just have to say, I'm getting better at it finally, but just reached out to a couple of people in the last few days. And I am just so grateful to have a good therapist to talk to when I need to. I never feel like that's something to be embarrassed about, but also having friends to reach out to when I need to and have them kind of walk through difficult times with me. I hope I do the same for them, but I have neglected to give friends the opportunity in the past. So it's just such a good thing to do, when you hit a little bit of a rough patch, to just be able to reach out and say, hey, I could use your company. Want to go for a walk? And it has been lovely. Got to this weekend go to the local alpaca farm close by in Georgia. I live in Tennessee, of course, so I went to the alpaca farm and a hike with a good friend of mine, Chip, the podcaster, on his podcast is At Home. And I have got to check the title of that because I knew it until I said it to you. And then suddenly I just went blank. But anyway, I adore podcasting and bringing you wonderful people that I meet. And I don't know, it's just been a great way to connect with people I wouldn't have had the joy to meet otherwise. I hope you love today's episode. Let me know. As ever, I'm at lameredith.com and hop onto the email list. Thanks so much for being here. And I'm going to introduce you to Jack Maher in just a little bitty second. Jack Maher, thank you so very much for being on Persistence U with us today. How are you doing in beautiful Colorado? Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me on your beautiful podcast, Elizabeth. It's a beautiful day here in Colorado. We've got springtime in the Rockies after a snowstorm moved through, so typical Colorado. And I'm looking out at lilacs and aspen trees and birds, and life is good. I am a historical novelist and a retired TV news executive and multimedia journalist. I have written a book called Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life. And this book is about my grandfather, who was one of the earliest curators at the Denver Art Museum. And he and his father traveled on horseback through the great American Southwest in the early part of the 20th century to get to know and to befriend Native people, especially Native artists.
Okay.
And he took this love that he, had of these people and their art and put it into a museum, which at the time was unprecedented. A lot of people, unfortunately, at that time in our history, did not consider Native American art to be art. And so he wanted to make sure they knew this is just as good, this Hopi seed pot is just as good as a Renaissance painting. And he dedicated his life to that. And so that
Wow.
is what that book is about.
Okay.
Now, the part that I want to really devote this podcast to is the inspiration behind this book. And it was my brother, Chris. He was really a primary force and a spark behind this novel. Now, this great life that my grandfather had was in stark contrast to the life of my brother and myself. Because growing up, our little family was afflicted with mental illness and alcoholism. There were many long nights that included anger and violence and police calls. I remember we had separate rooms in the basement, and we would call out quietly to each other during these terrible arguments you'd hear upstairs. And we would just call out to make sure that we were doing okay. So we kind of watched each other's backs. And we often went to school on very little sleep. And we pretended that everything was okay when it really wasn't. Well, eventually we outgrew this chaos and we moved on with our lives. But we always shared that bond of survival. So I went to college. I married a beautiful redhead named Becky. I built a career in broadcasting. I raised a family. Chris remained single, and he decided against higher learning. And he spent quite a bit of time really trying to find his true calling. He was a talented artist. And in high school, he excelled in pen and ink drawings. He really did a good job with human anatomy. And he used that skill to draw a superhero strip for the school paper. We called it Super Jock. I was on the paper at the time. And so when he was in this period of self-discovery post-high school, he unfortunately left art behind, and he ended up working in manufacturing, specifically electroplating. Well, one morning while at work, this is hard, so forgive me, a mentally ill man who'd been a former neighbor of ours came to my brother's workplace, armed with a handgun. He shot Chris several times. He left, and within minutes, he went on to murder my brother's best friend. Well, the day this happened, I was working graveyards at a Denver TV station producing a morning news program. And I remember the assignment desk telling me in my headset that we were sending our news helicopter to cover a breaking story about a workplace shooting. And it was a very brief report. There weren't many facts. I had no idea that Chris was the victim.
Oh.
So it was only hours later at home when I got a call from a police detective who was trying to tell me as gently as he could that my brother had been shot several times and he was in critical condition at the hospital. I was numb with shock. And I'm not sure I really heard much of what the detective really said after the first few minutes. I will never forget going to visit Chris at the hospital. He was, of course, wrapped in bandages. He was hooked up to machines. The doctors told me he was in bad shape, that they were doing everything possible and that I could only stay for a minute or two. He was pretty much out of it, but I remember leaning into him and I tried to encourage him. "You're strong," I told him. "I know you're going to make it through." Somehow, he had the awareness and the strength to move his head and to raise his right hand, and he gave me a thumbs up. And that simple gesture gave me hope. Well, Chris did survive physically, but he never recovered emotionally and psychologically, especially when he learned of the murder of his best friend. The man who shot him was judged mentally incompetent to stand trial, and he was institutionalized. Chris tried his best to get back on track, but increasingly he turned to alcohol, here we go again, to get rid of the trauma and the pain. He thought moving away from Colorado might help. And for a time, he was very successful at a sales job in California. But the alcohol intake increased, and he kept slipping farther into darkness. He eventually lost the job and became homeless. I knew nothing of this, Lisbeth. Every time we communicated, he was upbeat. Well, as I've said, we'd learned from our chaotic childhood how to hide ugly truth. So he lived this way on the streets for months until one night he finally called me. He was at rock bottom, called collect, and he told me everything. I can only imagine how hard that call was for him, the humility it required. I sent him money for a bus ticket, and I had him stay with me. And I have to tell you, it was difficult on our young family. He was clearly damaged, and we weren't equipped to really deal with his challenges. I got Chris into rehab. I found him a small place downtown, and he found another sales job. Things appeared to be looking up. I'll take a drink here. Our last time together was in the front seat of my car, and I was dropping him off where he lived. And I told him how proud I was of him trying to start over. He cried, he hugged me, he told me he loved me. I did the same and reminded him not to forget how much he'd overcome in life, despite all the darkness. I repeated what I told him in the hospital after he'd been shot. "You're strong. You're going to make it through." We talked for quite a while. He asked me what I thought I'd be doing in the years to come. I told him how I was hoping one day when my broadcasting days were over to write a book about our grandfather and his contributions to the Denver Art Museum and to the world of Native American art. At the time, neither of us really knew a great deal about our grandfather, Poppy. He was just this interesting, important figure, but very distant in our family history. At that moment, my main focus was getting the next day's morning show on the air, picking up the kids from school, spending time with Becky, making sure Chris was okay. So we said goodbye. A few days later, I got a call, and this time it was from the coroner's office, and Chris was dead. He had taken his life. He was just 33. He'd left a handwritten note. The person from the coroner's office cautioned me against reading it, but I had to. And there were tear stains across it. Basically, Chris said he was just too tired to fight anymore. And he closed it by apologizing. by telling me how much he loved me. And he closed the note with these words: "Someday, promise me you'll write that book." So here I am, more than 30 years later, and the book is done. And the dedication reads, "To Chris, a promise kept."
I love it. That is perfectly beautiful. You did it.
I did.
I'm so sorry for your loss, but what a lot of effort you were able to do for your sibling. Even in life, he knew how much that he meant to you. That's very clear. And he was a priority. So what a beautiful thing that you honored that.
I appreciate you saying that. I do need to mention that there was another aspect to writing this book, Poppy. It was also fueled by the sudden, unexpected death of my sweet Becky. She suffered a massive brain aneurysm while at church, comforting a stranger. And there is a beautiful, actually very religious story about that, which I won't go into now because of the time that we have. But there's no question that I channeled my grief about her and, of course, about Chris into this work.
Mm.
And I think you understand this, and I know a lot of people that have suffered loss understand this, that it can be an engine for creativity, if you allow it. And I've been recently reading a man by the name of Thomas More, you may or may not be familiar with. He was a former monk.
Yes.
And decided that that wasn't his life. He ended up becoming married and he became a counselor and a philosopher and a writer. He writes about what he calls the dark night of the soul. Have you heard of this?
Yes. But please do explain.
He says, this is not just a feeling, but a rupture in your being. He says a dark night is a way to return to living. It pares life down to the essentials. It helps you to get a new start. And he says something quite profound. You don't choose a dark night for yourself. It is given to you. Your job is to get close to it and sift it for its gold. Well, I can honestly say, Lisbeth, that that's what I've tried to do with this book.
What a beautiful, beautiful analogy. You've mined for its gold, and you have also honored a commitment made. And it's not easy to write a book, especially, well, I do think that I personally write better when things are rough. It turns out last couple of weeks I've been writing like a fiend, but it's very good that you see that possibility inside the pain and that you've offered it as a gift.
It is such a strange thing, and I know it's hard for people to probably comprehend that, but it can be such a vital force of energy if again, you allow it to do that. I have a bunch of little clippings on my refrigerator. You might also, they're little motivational things that help me keep going. To paraphrase Betty Davis, she once said, "Old age ain't for sissies." And I would say old age or widowhood ain't for sissies either. It's a hard thing living this life without someone that you loved for almost half a century.
Wow.
Becky and I made a great team. But one of these little clippings is from a guy named Viktor Frankl. He was a psychiatrist and he was imprisoned at Auschwitz. And all the family members that were there with him were murdered. He survived. He said, human beings can find meaning and the motivation to persevere through suffering by unlocking their sense of purpose and by developing a rich inner life. And I can honestly say, since losing my brother and since losing my wife, I truly have found that to be the case. I'm sort of in a season now where this stillness I've allowed to fill my life creates a richness that I can draw upon, not only to write, but to think about, to think deeply. In this world, there are so many distractions. You're just a swipe away from the next TikTok video. And that's just not a way to live. It really isn't. And I think we would all be better off if we would recognize the importance of stillness and reflection and just going to those deep thoughts. And if you want to write them down in however form, mine took the form of a novel, but someone else's might be a diary or even a letter. It can be anything, but to take that time. And if you have scars, and I'm not talking about physical scars, I'm talking about emotional scars, lead with them. Be proud of them. They're proof of your humanity.
I like that. I like that. And I feel like that's so anti today. If you do look on social media, often people are filled with images that make them feel less than because everyone appears to have figured out their finances and their family and their future. And that's wonderful if that's true, but it certainly can make a person feel incredibly other and lonely and not belonging, a sense of not belonging. You say that, that's so true. One of my first podcast guests, who I still think about a lot, told me, we as humans, he said, we do connect so much more with our brokenness than we do with our bragging, basically. And it's true.
Well, I am a Catholic, and of course, Catholics are all about suffering, but it's true. If we can bind our suffering, and whether you were a person of faith or not, in my case, I bind my suffering to the suffering of Christ. But if you can bind your suffering to something higher, something more noble, it sure goes a lot easier. I can tell you from experience.
That's beautiful. I just love it. Now, did you feel a good sense that, when you dedicated your book, when you finished it, did you ever get a feeling that your brother would know that?
I certainly hope so. I don't know that I had any sign from him per se. In fact, I must tell you something kind of disturbing. The night that he died, that he took his life, I know exactly the time it happened because I was here at home with, Becky and the kids. And it was late at night, like around 11:30 at night. And we had a door that led down to the basement, and it was open. And there were no windows open in the house. And right at around 11:30, that door slammed so violently that it made the house shudder.
Oh.
And I just knew psychically that it was something bad. And it wasn't long after that I got the call from the coroner's office. So honestly, I hoped after I finished the book and I dedicated it to Chris that maybe, in some way he'd let me know that it was okay. But and I am a person who looks for signs. I believe rainbows are signs, of God's promise to us. I look at the beautiful birds in spring and the lilacs that Becky loves so much. And I definitely see her, and I have had signs from her. But I can't say that I've really had that from Chris. And that's why I was eager to talk about him with you today, because I think it's important to acknowledge his life, as troubled as it was, and the contributions he did make in his brief 33 years on this earth. And so, by dedicating the book, maybe in a way I'm helping others to kind of, I don't know if people skip over those dedications or not, but maybe it'll lead them to I wonder who Chris was. And the answer is here.
Oh, I love that. I think that's absolutely beautiful. And I would, if you have a picture, by the way, that you wanted to share of you and him when you were, just take a picture of that and email it to me. That would be great before this publishes. But I think what a wonderful way to honor his memory and to keep his memory alive. And, I'm not Catholic, but for a brief time when I was married, I did, and I have great appreciation for the Greek Orthodox faith. And when someone dies, they always say, may his memory be eternal, or may her memory be eternal. I think that's absolutely lovely. And that's one beautiful thing writing does provide, is that way to keep that candle burning for them. So congratulations.
I thank you very much for the time you've taken with me today. It means a lot to me, Elizabeth.
Well, I appreciate you being so open and honest. This was just beautiful. And where can our listeners and viewers, where can they learn more about how to get your book? Tell us where they can connect with you, please.
Absolutely. It is sandgoatmanorpublishing.com. That's quite a mouthful, and I know you'll put a link up. Sandgoatmanorpublishing.com. And because of my multimedia background, I've got some multimedia on that site.
Excellent. Okay.
Connected with the book, and of course my email and all that. I'd love to hear from anyone who maybe is going through a dark night of the soul, and maybe I can help them a little bit with my perspective.
I think that's just absolutely fabulous. I thank you so much for being here. And let me just pause this. That was so stunning. I hope you enjoyed Jack Maher as much as I did. And I'm not kidding. I wasn't sure the road we were going to take with the interview, and that was so perfect for, I don't know, just for everyone. I love his conversation about Dark Night of the Souls. There are, I just want to bring up that nobody ever has to go through dark times alone. And there are of course, if a person is widowed recently or long ago, there are many different support groups available, and we've had people on the podcast even about that. But also there is the suicide hotline, and it's just important to note that no one ever had, I'm looking that number up. If you were watching on YouTube, you're seeing me look at my phone. I'm sorry about that, but just dialing 988. If you are in the States, everyone has a different suicide hotline, but I don't think in a life it's that uncommon that we think about, can I keep doing this? Can I go on? I think we have a hard time sharing what's really going on in our heart and letting people know, hey, I'm at a low spot. I'm feeling vulnerable. I'm feeling alone. I'm feeling like I can't keep moving forward. I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of, but just know that there are people either in your community or on a hotline or online, whatever, that care and can help and can walk through it with you or with the person you love. So what a great conversation. I'm so excited that he came by Persistence U. Thankful that you are here. To my mighty patrons, thank you so much. In April, I gave you access to a wonderful new resources on writing. So if you're interested in supporting the podcast or my writing, join me at patreon.com/Lisbeth Meredith, and feel free to sponsor me. It costs as much as a cup of coffee, or you can sponsor for a little more if you like, and hop in or out at any point. Thank you, though. You being here, sharing it with a friend, giving the podcast a rating, anything is just so incredibly helpful. I value your time. I hope you have a great week.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's show. Thank you so much for listening. Now, to find out more, head on over to lameredith.com and be sure to hop on the mailing list too. If you've enjoyed this show, please leave a rating and review or share with a friend. And if you really liked it, go ahead and subscribe so that you never miss another episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Persistence U with Lisbeth.